Welcome to the Wayne Township Public Schools podcast, Referendum series. In this special series, we will be your guide through the vital discussions shaping our community's strength for the future. We're committed to providing clarity and transparency through this podcast. Join us as we guide you through the upcoming March 12th referendum. Welcome to the third podcast in our referendum series, where we're going to break some myths about the referendum. Joining me today is Dr. Toback, Superintendent of Schools. Dr. Toback, there's a lot of information swirling around town about this referendum. Not all of it is based on facts. As the Superintendent of Schools, you work very closely every day with the district's building needs and budget. Can we talk about some myths that are being discussed so that people can understand more about the school finance before they vote on March 12th?
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate this creative and engaging format for our new podcast. It's a great way of sharing information, and it also shows the community that we are listening.
The first myth I want to ask you about is that saving up for maintenance costs make more sense than using bond funding.
So that is a very good question, something really important to talk about. So the school district does save and address maintenance issues on an ongoing basis. So years and years of work have been put into the district already when it comes to replacing roofs, doing concrete work, pointing bricks. There's a whole host of work the district has been doing over the past many years. And the relatively new maintenance reserve account that we have in our budget is a part of that. So that's something we've been developing to help us fund some of these projects. I'd say that the average person might think that debt is a sign of poor planning, or at least in some cases it is, and it will in the end cost more money. But what's really important is to understand that the opposite is really true for school districts, especially here in New Jersey because of state aid. So ultimately, the state of New Jersey considers school renovation work, school maintenance work incredibly important in every community, and they provide a significant amount of state aid for projects. So by moving ahead with the bond referendum, the district is in many ways saving up. It's saving up the opportunity for state aid rather than saving up local tax money. In this case, in the amount of about $39 million. The operating budget comes almost entirely from local taxes. So we use the operating budget to stretch the lifespan of something like a leaking roof with patches until we can replace the entire section with bond funding. That comes from local taxes plus state aid. So that's how we save the opportunity to get funding from outside and to enhance the local tax base. So interestingly, Wayne Township residents and all residents of New Jersey who are paying taxes already pay into this fund that allows for state aid for school construction, school renovation.
So we have also heard that teachers drive the educational process, and therefore that maintenance projects like roofing and HVAC controls don't really play a big role. Dr. Toback, do things like heating, ventilation, and drainage really affect education?
So Tracy, absolutely. There's a lot of things that affect education. Anything that is a distraction affects education. So our teachers are terrific, and they work around a lot of challenges. And they do that every day. But think about it. If you're cold, it's hard to focus. So students' attention is focused on staying warm. Likewise, if it's really hot in a classroom, in some cases in the 80-degree range, it's also very hard to focus. Some of our schools, like Lafayette Elementary, have heating systems that are more than 50 years old. They don't function well. They result in buildings that have hot spots and cold spots. So added together, that's a distraction that affects the educational process. Ventilation refers to the exchange of air, bringing fresh air in rather than recirculating air. Proper ventilation brings air through a filter. Think about someone who has allergens or asthma. Many of our students do. Those conditions make it hard to concentrate. When the pollen count is high, more students leave classrooms to go to the nurse's office. Poor ventilation certainly affects their education, and that's nothing the awesome power of a teacher can overcome. Leaky roofs can disrupt the school day. In Scott Colfax, a leaking roof meant the media center would be closed for an extended period of time. Dripping water in a classroom, as you can imagine, is a major distraction for students and staff. So another important way that these maintenance projects affect education is a budget matter. Without bond funding, any building improvement come from the same local tax base that is already funding our educational programs. Dollars for educational support will compete with dollars for HVAC systems, roof repairs, things like that.
So speaking of competing dollars, I know there have been comments about the projects that relate to physical education, athletics, and after-school activities. Some people seem to remember older discussions when there were some ambitious ideas for athletic facilities. So what's in the referendum now?
So the answer is that there was an earlier proposal for athletics that was more expansive than what we have now. Board pared down that list for needs versus wants. And so right now, we're basically down to 4 things at each of our high schools. The first improvement is the bleachers. Our bleachers were built in the 1960s. And at this point, we all recognize there's some issues of safety and accessibility. Right now, our bleachers are not handicapped accessible. There are no railings. And so for anyone who has mobility problems, it's very difficult to make your way onto the bleachers as it stands right now. As far as safety, we know that there was a tragic situation where a child fell through the bleachers at Wayne Valley. Fortunately, the child was not injured, but the fact is that we are certainly aware that there was a problem. The child fell through because the bleachers do not meet modern code, which means there is no riser. A riser is essentially a board that is placed between the seating and the footboards that prevents people or objects from falling underneath the bleachers. So press boxes, which we have now, are simply part of the athletic facility that exists at every high school. So if you go to any high school, you will see a press box, and that's the place where sometimes the press, sometimes scouts, they're seated. But more importantly, it's the game announcers and it's the coaches from our own teams who need a bird's eye view of what's happening on the athletic field. So a very important part of any athletic complex. And like I said, something that we have right now at both of our high schools. Team rooms. So ultimately, our lockers for our athletic teams are an important place. Those are also extremely old. And our locker rooms. So a quick tour of our lockers would show that many are broken. In the end, they are 60-year-old lockers that definitely need some work. The other issue is that the lockers themselves are in many ways an obstacle to supervision. They are 6 feet tall. They are in a design basically that creates lots of small spaces for students to change. And it is very difficult for any of the adults who are supervising to see what's going on in the locker room because of the height of these lockers. So the proposed change is to reduce the height, much like a lot of schools do. They make sure they maximize the ability for adults to supervise in the locker room. So some people think, well, all this is being invested in athletics, but our locker rooms are used every single day by students at both of our high schools, and they may not necessarily participate in athletics. It's PE, it's required. And so thousands of students use these rooms every day. So the need goes far beyond the after-school sports teams. As far as the state aid part goes, we do get state aid for every other project we're talking about, except for the bleachers, press boxes, and the team rooms. That's an important fact. So a breakdown real quick, about $11 million for bleachers and press boxes, $2.5 million for team rooms. That's less than 8% of the total referendum. About $3.5 million for locker rooms. That's about 2% of the total. So about 10% of the referendum is for projects that are directly related to safety and accessibility. These are not proposed to, quote, enhance our sports programs beyond those 2 goals.
Thanks for breaking that myth. We do have a lot of student athletes, but for sure we have more students who take physical education classes. That's a requirement for high school. So Dr. Toback, another myth seems to be that the district has not grown in enrollment. So why would we need more classrooms?
So the first myth is that enrollment numbers are the only factor in the need for space. That's not true. Other factors include more personalized teaching, more hands-on activities, more inclusion for students who have special needs, and more support services. So if you create a broad category, it also has to do with how our buildings are used every day. Second myth is that we haven't had higher enrollment. So that's not true either. Enrollment is stable from a district-wide count and growing over the past few years. Yet the elementary schools are crowded. Again, it's not an issue of space so much as an issue of how our buildings are used. So the third myth is that new housing developments that are either planned or under construction in Wayne Township won't increase crowding further. There are different ways of projecting that impact. Common sense says that hundreds of new housing units will translate into more students. Factors of enrollment are going to be covered in a separate podcast. So maybe it's best not to get into the details about that now, but we will later. Yes, there are myths surrounding enrollment for the Wayne Township Public Schools. Board of Education is taking a proactive approach to be ready for new enrollment, which in turn keeps our current schools from getting even more crowded. So we'll be recording that podcast about enrollment next week. So listeners should definitely tune back to hear more.
Another myth is that building additions at several elementary schools would be less expensive than an entirely new building. Can you break that myth for us?
People might think about a building addition as something that's fairly quick to design and build. It sounds like a smaller project than an entire school, but in fact, the additions that were proposed were significant additions. They included classrooms, other facilities. So when you add it together, those were all significant undertakings. Our architect considered that with the board and advised that one building is more economical. Ultimately, free space already exists at the Preakness site. Construction can take place at one site, and that means there's economies of scale. Also, the Preakness site is very strategic. It is right where an increase of enrollment is projected, so there's no need to redistrict. It allows the neighborhood system of schools that we have to stay intact.
Thanks for sharing about the district's commitment to neighborhood schools. There was a question at the community forum about all of the new housing and whether the township budget could help with the school district with the cost of these new students. That could be considered a myth, right?
That would be considered a myth. Legal and financial advisors clarified this at the community forum. The township has sole authority over the approval of housing developments. The school district has no role there, but we are obligated to plan for the future. Budget of the township and school district are entirely separate. I don't know the details of their budget. The township council members don't know the details of our cost and our revenue. Neither organization is involved in the other's operations or decision-making. The Wayne schools are responsible for educating every child who is a resident. The district's role begins there. Township is not required to contribute anything towards the district's expenses.
So the last myth I want to ask you about relates to the idea that if voters say no on March 12th, the Board of Education could hold another referendum in just a few months. Can a referendum be held again so quickly?
I would say that's very unlikely. First of all, the state of New Jersey allows just 5 dates each year for those kinds of votes. The specific dates are in September, when people are just coming back to school. That's a tough time. Right now, we're out of the fall. The next date is December, January, and then March. Or a question can be tacked on to the lengthy general election ballot in early November. So that is a tough time to have a referendum question added on to a general election ballot. So all said and done, it is a very difficult thing to put together something so quickly. So a more realistic timeline might be something similar to the timeline in Beckton Regional High School in East Rutherford. So 2 years ago, they had a referendum that failed. And over the past 2 years, the board went back, prioritized, looked at some other options. And so now the referendum is coming back to the community. That was a 2-year timeline. It does take time. And it also takes time to prioritize and for Board of Education to have those kind of discussions when it comes down to reducing the referendum and making decisions about what to cut. So to get to where we are today, it required years and years of work to get to over 60 projects that we have in this referendum. Those discussions, checking out competing interests, thinking about issues that are really hard to tackle. Like if we don't move ahead with bleachers, then maybe we can go ahead with security vestibles, right? Or should we do the other? Should we go ahead with the bleachers and maybe wait on the security vestibules? That's a really hard discussion for any board to have because ultimately you're talking about different types of safety and security and whose safety is more important and things like that, things that have no answers. And so that's the kind of discussions that the board would have to engage in, and that requires a lot of time. So there's a lot of steps that are involved in advance of a referendum, plans, prioritizing projects like I talked about, submitting documentations, drawing cost estimates. It is true that a lot of that work is done, but it still has to go back to the Department of Ed. It still takes many months typically for them to review projects. And once state funding is known, the idea is that we finalize the board's decision about what would be on the ballot and then move ahead. The ballot language has to go to the county 2 months before a vote, which means a referendum in the fall would really be a referendum that has to be put together in the summer. So as you can see from the timelines and the different factors, it would be very difficult to just come back again in the fall with a new referendum. In the meantime, all the construction, all the projects that are planned in the community are moving ahead at the speed that they are planned at. In other words, none of these people are waiting for the Board of Education to come up with a plan.
So thank you so much, Dr. Toback, for joining us to break all of these myths. To our listeners, please join us next week where we talk more about student enrollment, and our guests will be an elementary school principal and a school teacher.
Let's continue to work together, keeping our community informed. Thank you for being part of this conversation as we learn together about the proposal to strengthen the future of Wayne Township Public Schools.